go.
Here we go.
Like you should.
Like you should.
Feel the sweat.
Feel the sweat.
On your face.
On your face.
Here we go.
Here we go.
Like you should.
Like you should.
Feel the sweat.
Feel the sweat.
On your face.
On your face.
Oh, good.
Oh, good.
Oh, good.
Oh, good.
Here we go.
Here we go.
All right.
All right.
Here we go.
Here we go.
Like you should.
Like you should.
Feel the sweat. On your face.
Colonial and military collaborators are not new in history. Native rulers were always used to legitimize new powers of authority in a specific area, and in Africa, it was the same thing. But most importantly, almost always after these collaborators overused their usefulness, they were quickly disposed of. One of the only exceptions of this lies with the Franco-African and Portuguese-African Evolues and Assimilados, who quickly became the most important caste in post-colonial African history. While their rule have been disasters, creating the appalling conditions and situations of the countries like the modern-day Congo and other impoverished African countries. Of course, discussion about the Evolues must start with an answer to an essential question: what is an Evule? An Evule, and also represented in Portuguese Africa as an Assimilado, were Africans who, after shedding their native culture and religion, were given the right to be seen as political equals to their colonizers, or in the Belgian context, were simply given more rights in the apartheid colony of the Congo. To attain such status, one had to be able to speak colonial languages perfectly, abandon all vestiges of African cultures, and recognize the perceived dominance of the European groups and adopt their mannerisms. Many Evolues up to decolonization either reinforced their perceived inferiority or rejected it and returned to their African identity fully to come to terms with the radical new environment of a post-colonial Africa. Another important distinction is who is not an Evule. Evules were never people who simply understood languages from their colonizers or were Western educated. That would mean people like Kwame Nkrumah or Julius Nyerere were Evules, and that is simply not the case. The most important distinction was that Evules saw themselves as inferior to Europeans in order to feel superior to Africans within their own lands, while Pan-Africans embraced their Africanness at the expense of European mannerisms. These disagreements would contribute to the intellectual and often violent battle between right-wing Evules versus left-wing Pan-Africans, both seeking to implement their view on the way African people ought to act and live in the new environment of a decolonized Africa. When looking into Evules closer, we must ask ourselves another question. Where were these Evules located, and why were their colonial oppressors' view on reality important to understand the specific instance and creation of the Evule class? Although the idea of an assimilated class of natives used to administer were always present across Africa and Asia during their time of European dominance, the phenomena of Evules and Assimilados as well were rooted within the unique Latin method of colonizing with the civilizing mission, in which, already seeing themselves as heirs of a superior Roman civilization, found themselves being responsible for the diffusion of Western values of governance, religion, and language to the quote-unquote uncivilized masses of the world. Of course, this viewpoint is done through the very dated and incorrect lens of white supremacy and Eurocentricity. It is important to realize that the French, for example, teaching the Gabonese their language, converting them to Catholicism, and introducing them to the French way of dress was not done from the goodwill of their hearts, but from the cold need to implant their views of superiority to the native people. Extracting their resources was simply not enough. The Portuguese had a similar view on this, practicing a colonial strategy called Luso-tropicalism, where they believed the unique climate of Portugal allowed them to be more agreeable and possess greater morality within Europe, and allowed them to colonize the lands of the equator, not caring of racial ideology per se, but like this and the Franco-Belgian civilizing mission all depended on the pretense of Western superiority across the many quote-unquote uncivilized groups of the world, centered in Africa and Asia at the time. So in conclusion, the Evule phenomenon was found with the British and Belgian and Portuguese African colonies as opposed to the more indirect rule the British partook in. Now, since we have a clear definition of Evules and their locations, we can start using this criteria to identify Evules across Africa and find their importance within history. Let's start with the most famous example of Evules with the Belgian Congo. In general, Evules had a large presence within the Belgian Congo, who numbered well over 100,000 and were used for urban jobs, becoming the colony's first proletariat. But because of the warped history and the intentions of becoming an Evule, many had no interest in winning victory with independence and economic justice, who, like before, admitted fully to the colonial notion of their African cultures and languages being inferior. Probably the most famous of this caste would be Patrice Lumumba and Mobutu Sese Seko. The two are the most well-known examples of the often tragic conflict between re-Africanized Evules and the Evule who reinforced his status, as there were no Europeans to feel inferior to, only the millions of their own people to feel superior towards. So focusing on the two, it is easy to see the many comparisons. Both Lumumba and Soko were colonial Evules within the Belgian Congo and would contribute heavily to the growing sense of nationalism within Africa. The kind which desired to remove the barrier of ethnicity and language, and were at least very populist and often African socialists or Marxist-Leninists. Seeing with Lumumba's compatriots like Nkrumah Nyerere, Mengistu Haile Mariam, and Agostinho Neto, the main distinction between the two was that Lumumba was an idealist who, still taking pride in his Congolese heritage, had a deep fascination with the many European nationalist movements who could simply not be replicated within the post-colonial era of Africa. Because of this, he was often manipulated by the Machiavellian character of Soko, who was a brutal realist of the situation in the country and was always prepared to exacerbate tribal tensions within the colony. And soon, after Lumumba's blunders with the Western-sponsored rebels in Katanga and South Kasai, was soon deposed and executed, his death being sponsored by Soko, Belgium, and the United States, who soon after consolidating power within the Congo, Soko would have an iron fist over the country, selling his land to Western interests for his own pocket gain while crushing any dissent towards his regime within the Congo. Another area of Evule rule turning disastrously is with the rule of Jean Bodel Bokassa, who would famously take power in a military coup in the Central African Republic and crown himself Bokassa I of the Central African Empire. He would spend most of his government budget on his Napoleonic coronation and would be famous for cannibalizing his nation both figuratively and literally. But an important distinction here is that he strayed away from the other native African kingdoms and monarchies like Morocco and Ethiopia, who had their own traditions drawing from cultural practices. But with Bokassa, he would abandon all resemblances of an African empire that would celebrate Central African cultural practices. Instead, he would make clear comparisons to Napoleon I of France. While Napoleon is a famous and inspirational figure that can be admired by all, Bokassa finds himself in the grouping of Evules as he was filled with a deep inferiority complex, which did lead to his admiration for Napoleon. This inferiority complex came from his trauma as a child. He would see his father beaten to death, and soon later his own mother would take her life as a result. The product here resembled many others on the continent. Trauma could lead to a deep hatred for a colonizer, or trauma would lead to a twisted admiration for the colonizer's values. This is what happened with Bokassa. The line where his admiration for Napoleon ended and his veneration of simply a powerful white Frenchman started is when he started perceiving inferiority from himself through trauma and also his French education he received later on in his life. The last and most glaring lesson of the stain of Evules and Assimilados lies with the Angolan independence struggle. While later devolving into a physical conflict over autonomy or independence, there was also a large intellectual battle to where the Angolan spirit would turn to. On one side, there were Assimilados, a more privileged group of urbanites and students who would attempt to assimilate to Portuguese culture. This phenomenon was promoted by the Portuguese government, who cemented their authority and the authority of the Assimilados within the colony of Angola and also Mozambique. While enjoying a more wealthy lifestyle, the Assimilados were placed in a limbo of sorts. While not being able to be fully accepted by their white Portuguese counterparts, they also received high resentment from the black, non-assimilated, poorer Africans or socialist student movements. When faced with this dilemma, many either joined resistance movements like the MPLA headed by Agostinho Neto, or reasserted their support for the Estado Novo regime of Antonio G. Oliveira Salazar. These new re-Africanized assimilados who would place their support for the MPLA would immediately begin crafting the new Angolan identity, ripping away from their Europeanized living and also tribal politics. People like Agostinho Neto would fully commit to the creation of this identity, which in Angola is called the Angolidade, or the sense of Angolanness. This contrasted with the reactionary and aggressive approach by more famous Joseph Savimbi, who allowed apartheid South African troops to occupy parts of Angola and bent over backwards for colonialist and imperialist aid, while expanding and worsening ethnic ties and intended harmony of a new Angola. While Neto's faction, the MPLA, won the civil war and independence struggle at the end, the vulnerable position they were left in forced them to abandon the ideas of a new Angolan, forged from the struggle and enriched with socialist thought, as the post-Soviet world demanded many nations, by force if necessary, to at least adopt market-oriented economies to compete and be freed from neocolonialism. Colonial Angola represents a general African feeling of an internal war, and with the Angolan spirit and Angolan people, the idea of re-Africanization that is possible with the elites, or the doubling down of the ancien regime's treatment of assimilated Africans, something that Joseph Savimbi would surround himself in. Just food for thought. There is a reason why Call of Duty Black Ops 2 idealizes and lionizes Savimbi as a glorious fighter. He's none of that. He was horrible for Angola. So that concludes this video, and like I said before, I'm really gonna start committing to the videos talking uh about Gaddafi and also some stuff again on Ethiopian socialism and like the unique uh form it had when it came to, the 1974 junta. So since you made it this far, thank you again and goodbye.